August 18th, 1944. 22:10 hours. 320 feet beneath the surface of the South China Sea. Inside the pressure hull of an American submarine, Lieutenant Commander Henry Munson stood at the periscope, his posture rigid, his movements controlled. The air was stale with diesel fumes and sweat. Red lights cast long shadows across steel bulkheads. The crew spoke in whispers, not because sound carried through water, but because instinct demanded silence. On the radar screen, contacts bloomed across the darkness. Not one ship, not two, 13. A convoy of that size meant only one thing: troops. Munson studied the returns carefully. Course, speed, formation, escorts on the perimeter, aircraft patrols sweeping ahead. This was not routine merchant traffic. This was a high-priority reinforcement convoy, the largest he had seen in months. What Munson could not yet know was that his submarine, USS Rasher, was about to ignite the most catastrophic single night in the history of Japanese naval transport. A destruction so complete that it would echo through Imperial headquarters in Tokyo, through the bridge logs of convoy commanders across the Pacific, and through the nightmares of every Japanese sailor ordered to sea thereafter. Above the surface, aboard the escort carrier Taiyo, Captain Shuichi Sugino scanned the black horizon with mounting unease. The convoy, designated HY-71, carried nearly 5,000 Imperial Japanese Army soldiers, reinforcements desperately needed for the Philippines. The Empire's defenses were crumbling, island by island, and every transport that reached its destination mattered. But the sea was no longer Japan's ally. By the summer of 1944, Japanese shipping had been bleeding for more than 2 years. Transports vanished without warning. Tankers exploded in sheets of flame. Entire convoys disappeared between ports. Survivors spoke of invisible attackers, silent, precise, merciless. The Americans called them submarines. Japanese sailors had another name: the Silent Death. August 18th, 1944. 22:10 hours. 320 feet beneath the surface of the South China Sea. Inside the pressure hull of an American submarine, Lieutenant Commander Henry Munson stood at the periscope, his posture rigid, his movements controlled. The air was stale with diesel fumes and sweat. Red lights cast long shadows across steel bulkheads. The crew spoke in whispers, not because sound carried through water, but because instinct demanded silence. On the radar screen, contacts bloomed across the darkness. Not one ship, not two, 13. A convoy of that size meant only one thing: troops. Munson studied the returns carefully: course, speed, formation, escorts on the perimeter, aircraft patrols sweeping ahead. This was not routine merchant traffic. This was a high-priority reinforcement convoy, the largest he had seen in months. What Munson could not yet know was that his submarine, USS Rasher, was about to ignite the most catastrophic single night in the history of Japanese naval transport. A destruction so complete that it would echo through Imperial headquarters in Tokyo, through the bridge logs of convoy commanders across the Pacific, and through the nightmares of every Japanese sailor ordered to sea thereafter. Above the surface, aboard the escort carrier Taiyo, Captain Shuichi Sugino scanned the black horizon with mounting unease. The convoy, designated HY-71, carried nearly 5,000 Imperial Japanese Army soldiers, reinforcements desperately needed for the Philippines. The Empire's defenses were crumbling island by island, and every transport that reached its destination mattered. But the sea was no longer Japan's ally. By the summer of 1944, Japanese shipping had been bleeding for more than 2 years. Transports vanished without warning. Tankers exploded in sheets of flame. Entire convoys disappeared between ports. Survivors spoke of invisible attackers, silent, precise, merciless. The Americans called them submarines. Japanese sailors had another name: the Silent Death. When most people think of December 7th, 1941, they picture burning battleships at Pearl Harbor, explosions, aircraft, smoke rising from shattered hulls. But while Japanese aircraft struck Hawaii, another war began quietly, one that would ultimately prove far more decisive. In Philippine waters, 29 American submarines of the Asiatic Fleet lay in wait. Within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Thomas Hart issued an order that fundamentally altered naval warfare in the Pacific. Execute unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. No warnings, no prize rules, no mercy. Every Japanese merchant ship, tanker, and transport became a legitimate target. It was a radical decision, and an illegal one under international law as it existed before the war. But legality mattered little now. Survival did. Yet despite the boldness of the order, the American submarine force was profoundly unprepared to execute it. At the outbreak of war, the US Navy possessed 55 modern fleet submarines in the Pacific, supplemented by 18 obsolete S-boats, slow, uncomfortable, and dangerously outdated. Worse still, they carried a weapon that simply did not work. The Mark 14 torpedo, the pride of American naval ordnance, was catastrophically flawed. Its problems were many and deadly. The torpedo ran 11 feet deeper than set, passing harmlessly beneath targets. Its magnetic exploder detonated prematurely or failed entirely. Its contact exploder, meant to trigger on impact, often crumpled instead. For the first 18 months of the war, American submariners fired torpedo after torpedo that struck enemy ships and did nothing. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Ramage of USS Trout recorded his frustration in December 1941. Fired 4 torpedoes at a stationary Japanese transport from 1,500 yards. All 4 hit with solid metallic clangs. None exploded. Watched helplessly as the ship sailed away undamaged. Those metallic clangs haunted the submarine force. They called it the sound of betrayal. In early 1942, Japanese merchant officers sailed with confidence. Their naval leadership assured them that American submarines posed minimal threat. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine, developed in the 1920s and 1930s, assumed submarines would be used primarily against warships in fleet engagements, not against commerce. Japan had never seriously prepared for a war against commerce raiders. At the start of the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy had allocated just 47 vessels for convoy escort duty. Britain, by comparison, employed over 400 escorts in the Atlantic. Japanese depth charges were set to explode at 60 feet. American submarines routinely operated at 300 feet or deeper. Captain Tamichi Hara, later commander of destroyer Shigure, wrote after the war, "We treated submarine defense as an afterthought, a duty for obsolete ships and inexperienced crews. The elite destroyer force was reserved for fleet action. Protecting merchant ships was considered unglamorous, beneath the dignity of samurai warriors." This contempt for defensive warfare would prove fatal. By mid-1943, American submarine commanders had lost patience. Official explanations blamed crew error. Submarine skippers knew better, so they disobeyed orders. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of U.S. submarines in the Pacific, authorized clandestine tests. Torpedoes were fired at fishing nets suspended at known depths. They passed underneath. Others were fired at Hawaiian cliffs. They struck and failed to detonate. The truth was undeniable. The Mark 14 torpedo was defective. Once the depth mechanism was corrected, the magnetic exploder disabled and the contact exploder redesigned, American submarines transformed almost overnight. The silent war became lethal. In 1942, American submarines sank approximately 180 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 725,000 tons. Even with defective torpedoes, the damage was mounting. By 1943, the campaign accelerated beyond Japan's ability to respond. Aggressive commanders replaced cautious ones. New submarines entered service at a rate of 40 per year. Code breaking revealed convoy routes in advance. The results were devastating. On February 8, 1943, cargo liner Tatsuta Maru was torpedoed by USS Tarpon. The former luxury liner sank in 90 seconds. 943 passengers and crew died. There was no time for lifeboats. Executive Officer Yoshio Nakamura's final diary entry read simply, "Radar contact, American submarine." His watch stopped at 3:47. The sea took the rest. The sinking of Tatsuta Maru marked a psychological breaking point. Merchant officers who had once sailed confidently began requesting shore assignments. Crews demanded double pay for voyages through the Luzon Strait, soon known as Torpedo Alley. Convoy commanders falsified routes. Escorts dropped depth charges into empty seas. Survivors were often left floating for hours, rescue secondary to fear of another attack. A classified Japanese report captured in 1943 stated bluntly, "We are fighting an enemy we cannot see and cannot hurt." And the worst was yet to come. The sinking of Tatsuta Maru marked a psychological breaking point. Merchant officers, who had once sailed confidently, began requesting shore assignments. Crews demanded double pay for voyages through the Luzon Strait, soon known as Torpedo Alley. Convoy commanders falsified routes. Escorts dropped depth charges into empty seas. Survivors were often left floating for hours, rescue secondary to fear of another attack. A classified Japanese report captured in 1943 stated bluntly, "We are fighting an enemy we cannot see and cannot hurt." And the worst was yet to come. Japanese convoy doctrine evolved slowly and reluctantly. Convoys were formed not because leadership believed in their effectiveness, but because losses had become impossible to ignore. Escorts were added where possible, often older destroyers, converted trawlers, or hastily armed civilian vessels. Sonar equipment was primitive. Radar was virtually non-existent. The escort's presence provided psychological comfort, not real protection. American submarines began attacking at night on the surface using radar to track convoys from miles away. To Japanese lookouts, the sea appeared empty. To American radar operators, it was illuminated. By the time escorts detected an attack, torpedoes were already running. Japanese depth charges were dropped where submarines had been, not where they were. By mid-1943, Japanese merchant sailors understood a grim truth. Convoys did not guarantee safety. They concentrated death. A single successful submarine attack could cripple multiple ships in minutes. Survivors from one sinking often drowned when escorts maneuvered violently to evade further attacks. Lieutenant Tishi Nakao, escort officer aboard destroyer Urakazi, wrote privately in August 1943, "The convoys are becoming suicide runs. Merchant captains argue with my orders. They demand routes that add days but avoid known submarine zones. I cannot blame them. We lose ships faster than we can record their names." Escorts often could not stop to rescue survivors. To do so risked annihilation. Men were left in the water. The cruelty of the campaign deepened unintentionally. Japan transported prisoners of war and forced laborers aboard unmarked merchant vessels, ships later known as Hell ships. These vessels carried Allied POWs and Asian laborers locked below decks, without markings required by the Geneva Conventions. American submarines had no way to know. When these ships were torpedoed, the results were catastrophic. On July 23, 1943, transport Montevideo Maru, carrying over 1,000 Australian prisoners, was sunk by USS Sturgeon. There were no survivors among the prisoners. It became Australia's worst maritime disaster, unknown until after the war. American submariners learned of these tragedies only later. The war beneath the waves had become morally complex and unstoppable. The cruelty of the campaign deepened unintentionally. Japan transported prisoners of war and forced laborers aboard unmarked merchant vessels, ships later known as Hell ships. These vessels carried Allied POWs and Asian laborers locked below decks without markings required by the Geneva Conventions. American submarines had no way to know. When these ships were torpedoed, the results were catastrophic. On July 23, 1943, transport Montevideo Maru, carrying over 1,000 Australian prisoners, was sunk by USS Sturgeon. There were no survivors among the prisoners. It became Australia's worst maritime disaster, unknown until after the war. American submariners learned of these tragedies only later. The war beneath the waves had become morally complex and unstoppable. By early 1944, Japan's shipping crisis reached critical mass. The empire required 5.9 million tons of shipping to function. Available tonnage had fallen to 4.1 million. Monthly losses accelerated. January 1944, 112,000 tons sunk. February 1944, 217,000 tons sunk. March 1944, 167,000 tons sunk. Shipyards could not keep pace. Steel shortages, labor depletion, and bombing disrupted construction. Every sunk ship compounded the shortage. In April 1944, Japanese command attempted a major reinforcement effort, Teichi Convoy. The convoy carried 2 divisions bound for New Guinea and Mindanao. American submarines were waiting. USS Jack sank Yoshida Maru. 1,544 soldiers killed. USS Gurnard sank Arden Maru. 350 killed. USS Angler sank Taiye Maru. 600 killed. USS Gurnard returned to sink Tenshin Maru. 1,500 killed. The surviving ships diverted. Divisions were scattered, weakened, and unloaded far from their intended destinations. Days later, American forces landed at Hollandia, bypassing positions those divisions were meant to defend. Japanese imperial headquarters quietly acknowledged what had become undeniable. Some regions could no longer be reinforced. They were already lost. A captured Japanese analysis circulated among merchant officers in March 1944 concluded, "Defensive measures have failed. Increasing escort strength does not reduce losses. Rerouting convoys only reveals new submarine patrol zones. The American submarine force is too large, too informed, and too skilled for countermeasures to succeed." The conclusion was damning. Japan was losing the war, one transport at a time. A sea ruled by wolf packs. American submarines adopted coordinated wolfpack tactics in the Pacific, refining a concept pioneered in the Atlantic. Multiple submarines shadowed a convoy, relaying positions and attack timing. Escorts could chase one contact, never all of them. Japanese officers believed only Germans used wolfpacks. They were wrong. By mid-1944, American submarines were everywhere and nowhere, silent, patient, invisible. And the largest disaster was approaching. In August 1944, Japanese naval planners committed to one final gamble. Convoy H-171 was not routine resupply. It was an emergency operation designed to move fuel, ammunition, vehicles, aircraft parts, and thousands of troops from Singapore to the Philippines. The Empire's southern resources were useless unless they could reach the home islands. This convoy had to get through. The escort was unprecedented by Japanese standards. Aircraft carrier Taiyo escort carrier, Unyo multiple destroyers, and Kaibokan escort vessels, dozens of merchant ships. For once, Japanese commanders believed they had enough protection. They did not know the convoy had already been detected. U.S. intelligence intercepted convoy signals days before departure. Submarine Command issued orders with chilling simplicity. All available boats converge. At least 6 American submarines were vectored toward H-171, USS Rasher, USS Bluefish, USS Harder, USS Flasher, USS Spadefish, USS Hado. They took station along likely routes, communicating positions and timing. By the time the convoy left Singapore, it was sailing into a net already drawn tight. On the night of August 18, 1944, USS Rasher made radar contact. The convoy stretched for miles, dark shapes against darker water. Rasher penetrated the screen and fired a spread of torpedoes. Moments later, Teiya Maru erupted in flames. Teiomaru began listing heavily. Escort carrier Taiyo took 2 hits and broke apart. Taiyo sank in less than 30 minutes. Over 790 men went down with her. Panic rippled through the convoy. Searchlights snapped on, instantly silhouetting merchant ships for other submarines. As escorts broke formation to pursue Russia, the convoy fragmented. This was fatal. USS Bluefish struck next, torpedoing Unnyo, which staggered away, burning and dead in the water. USS Spadefish and USS Haddo attacked from opposite flanks. Merchant ships collided, attempting evasive maneuvers. Depth charges detonated blindly, far from their targets. The escorts were no longer protecting the convoy. They were reacting. By dawn, the damage was staggering. Escort carrier Taiyo sunk escort carrier Unnyo, fatally damaged, later sunk. Multiple transports destroyed, thousands of troops drowned before ever reaching combat. Survivors described screams echoing across the water. Then silence. The escorts rescued who they could. Most were left behind. Japanese convoy commanders did not speak of H-171 as a defeat. They spoke of it as a revelation. A post-action report stated, "Large-scale convoys attract concentrated submarine attack and cannot be adequately defended." This was not tactical criticism. It was an admission of helplessness. Convoys were no longer protection. They were targets. Following I-71, convoys were broken into smaller, less efficient groups. Sailing schedules became erratic. Some routes were abandoned entirely. Fuel stockpiles in the home islands dropped precipitously. The Navy began rationing fuel to training units. Pilots stopped flying. Ships stopped sailing. By late 1944, Japan still possessed factories, oil fields, and manpower. But the ocean, once its greatest advantage, had become an impenetrable wall. American submarines did not need to invade Japan. They were already strangling it. By late 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy still existed on paper. Battleships floated, cruisers remained intact. Destroyers sat moored in harbors, from Kure to Sasebo. On maps, Japan appeared capable of continued resistance. In reality, the fleet was already dead. The reason was not American carrier strikes or decisive surface battles. It was oil. Modern naval warfare runs on fuel as much as steel. Without it, even the most powerful warship becomes a stationary gun platform. Impressive, but irrelevant. Japan's access to oil had always been fragile. The empire possessed almost no domestic petroleum reserves. Every gallon had to be imported from the southern territories, Borneo, Sumatra, and the Dutch East Indies. That lifeline crossed waters now dominated by American submarines. In 1941, Japan imported roughly 90% of its oil by sea. By mid-1944, that figure had collapsed. Submarine attacks reduced tanker deliveries to a trickle. Entire convoys disappeared. Individual tankers were hunted relentlessly, often sailing alone and defenseless. By autumn, refinery throughput dropped sharply, fuel stockpiles fell below emergency reserves. Training flights were cancelled. Fleet exercises ceased almost entirely. Pilots were ordered to remain grounded to save fuel, even as American aircraft approached Japanese airspace with increasing frequency. The Navy had ships. It could not afford to move them. Fuel shortages did more than immobilize ships. They destroyed the future. Japanese naval aviation had once been among the best in the world. Before the war, pilots trained for years, accumulating hundreds of flight hours before entering combat. By 1944, that system no longer existed. Training hours were slashed to a fraction of pre-war standards. Some pilots received less than 30 hours of flight time before deployment. Others never fired live ammunition before combat. Veteran pilots were irreplaceable, and American submarines were ensuring they would never be replaced. Every tanker sunk was not just fuel lost, it was experience that could never be rebuilt. With fuel unavailable, Japanese naval doctrine shifted, not by choice but by necessity. Capital ships were reassigned as stationary coastal defense. Battleships like Yamato and Nagato remained at anchor for months at a time, their engines cold, their crews idle. They were no longer weapons of maneuver. They were symbols. American planners noticed immediately. Submarine patrol reports began describing Japanese harbors as crowded but inactive. Ships remained moored for weeks without movement. Escort patterns weakened. Anti-submarine patrols declined. The ocean no longer belonged to Japan. The collapse of maritime transport did not stop at the military. Civilian shipping was devastated. Food imports from Korea and China declined sharply. Rice shipments failed to arrive on schedule. Coal deliveries for power plants became unreliable. Cities experienced rolling blackouts. Rationing intensified. By early 1945, urban malnutrition increased dramatically. Children were evacuated from cities due to food shortages. Industrial output fell. Despite intact factories, Japan was being defeated without invasion. The submarine campaign had turned logistics into a weapon. One of the darkest consequences of Japan's shipping collapse was the continued use of unmarked prisoner transports, later known as hell ships. Thousands of Allied POWs were transported in cargo holds without markings, ventilation, or medical care. American submarines, unaware of their presence, attacked these vessels as legitimate military targets. The result was catastrophic. Entire transports went down, with prisoners trapped below decks. After the war, US submarine commanders learned what had happened, and many carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. The tragedy was not the result of cruelty by submarine crews. It was the inevitable outcome of a shipping system already broken beyond control. By late 1944, internal Japanese naval assessments became grim. Confidential memoranda circulated among senior officers stating plainly, fuel reserves were insufficient for decisive fleet action. Submarine losses could not be countered. Merchant shipping losses exceeded replacement capacity. One report concluded, even if the enemy invasion is delayed, national endurance will fail first. This was not defeatism, it was mathematics. American submarines had achieved something unprecedented. They had turned the Pacific Ocean itself into a hostile force, one that punished every attempt to move, resupply, or reinforce. No dramatic fleet engagement could have achieved this result so efficiently. No single battle carried this much strategic weight. The war was being won in silence, below the surface, one ship at a time. By early 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer a mobile force. It was a collection of stranded assets. Ships without fuel, pilots without training, factories without raw materials, cities without food, all connected by one cause. The submarines had done their work. By the beginning of 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final phase. On maps, Japan still controlled territory. Its army remained large. Its cities stood largely intact. To outside observers, invasion appeared inevitable, a final, brutal contest yet to come. But beneath the surface, the outcome had already been sealed. The decisive battles were over. They had been fought in shipping lanes, in narrow straits, and in the deep ocean where no cameras recorded victory. American submarines had finished dismantling Japan's ability to function as a modern state at war. Submarine patrols continued into 1945. But the nature of the war had changed. Targets were fewer. Convoys were smaller, poorly escorted, and often composed of old, slow vessels pressed into service out of desperation. Some submarines reported entire patrols without encountering a single organized convoy, a sign not of safety, but of collapse. When targets were found, they were often isolated ships carrying mixed cargo. Coal, rice, scrap metal, evacuated civilians. Japan was no longer trying to project power. It was trying to survive. Japanese anti-submarine escorts still existed, but they were shadows of their former strength. Fuel shortages limited patrol time. Crews were undertrained. Equipment was outdated or in disrepair. Some escorts were ordered to conserve fuel by remaining at anchor unless a submarine attack was confirmed, a paradox that rendered them ineffective. American submarines noticed. Attack reports describe escorts reacting slowly, dropping shallow depth charges inaccurately, and abandoning pursuit early to preserve fuel. The hunter no longer feared the guard. Even before the war ended, American planners were already studying the results. Submarine Force Pacific Fleet compiled detailed analyses showing that Japanese merchant shipping losses exceeded 55%, oil transport losses were even higher. Industrial output declined primarily due to lack of raw materials, not bombing. The conclusion was unmistakable. Submarines had done what strategic bombing alone could not. They had disconnected Japan from the resources required to continue fighting. After the war, multiple US Navy studies reached a controversial conclusion. Even without invasion, even without atomic weapons, Japan would likely have been forced to surrender due to logistical collapse alone. By mid-1945, fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. Food shortages were worsening rapidly, transportation infrastructure was failing, civilian morale was deteriorating. The empire could still resist. It could no longer sustain itself. Carrier battles captured headlines. Island invasions defined public memory. But when analysts compared outcomes, submarine warfare stood apart. For a relatively small investment, roughly 2% of US naval personnel, fewer than 300 submarines. The submarine force sank. Over 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, millions of tons of shipping, the economic foundation of the Japanese war effort. It was one of the most cost-effective campaigns in military history. Victory did not come without loss. American submarines suffered the highest casualty rate of any US naval branch. 52 submarines lost, over 3,500 submariners killed. There were no survivors from most sinkings. Their war was fought alone, underwater, far from rescue. Many crews never knew the full impact of their patrols. They simply sailed, hunted, and returned, or didn't. After surrender, Japanese naval officers reviewed the campaign with brutal honesty. They identified 3 fatal failures: underestimating submarines as a strategic threat, neglecting convoy doctrine and escort development, failing to prioritize anti-submarine warfare. Early one senior officer summarized it bluntly. "We lost the war at sea long before we realized it." The lessons of the Pacific Submarine War reshaped naval doctrine worldwide. Post-war navies concluded, sea control depends on logistics, not just fleets. Submarines are strategic weapons, not auxiliary forces. Economic warfare can be decisive without mass destruction. Modern naval planning still reflects those conclusions today. There were no victory parades for submarines, no iconic photographs, no single decisive battle to commemorate. Instead, there was absence, empty docks, silent factories, ships that never arrived. That absence ended the war. Japan was not defeated by one weapon, one battle, or one moment. It was defeated by a systematic collapse of movement, supply, and endurance. American submarines did not conquer territory. They removed the ability to fight for it. And by the time the world realized what had happened, the outcome was already inevitable.